How to Read Poetry Like a Professor by Thomas C. Foster.
Chapter 6. Our Word is Our Bond. It will not have escaped your attention that literature is made of words. Words matter in novels, but not quite the same way that they do in lyric poetry. A poem of the sort we're talking about might run from a couple to couple hundred lines and contain somewhere between a dozen and a very few thousand words, fewer than the difference between Dickens' David Copperfield and Bleak House. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that those words are likely to count for more than those in a Victorian triple-decker, if only because their count is so small. I stress here that this level of attention to words is a feature of lyric poetry. Dramatic or epic verse forms often have a somewhat looser relation to word choice. If not quite like novels, then leaning in that direction. Even then, assuming written and not oral epics, words matter greatly. And you know what the problem is with words? Poetry doesn't own them. There is no privileged language of poetry, or any literature for that matter. So poets have to make do with language that has been debased and devalued by many kinds of use and abuse. Any word you seek for your poem will have already been used in ways that cloud its meaning or steal its precision, or sometimes render it unusable. A writer before, say, 1970 or thereabouts, could use a phrase like hearts are gay without a second thought as to clarity or intent. After the word's appropriation by the gay pride movement, however, the word carries a different charge from anything it ever had before. The transformation came about faster and more comprehensively than any linguistic change most of us who lived through it can remember. That's okay. Gay, in the new sense, gets a lot more use than it did formerly, and language inevitably shifts to adapt to altered social conditions. A writer today, I suppose, can still use gay in the manner of Cole Porter or P.G. Wodehouse, but there will be consequences. The audience has changed its perceptions. Most alterations are more incremental and stem from less noble endeavors. Think about how official documents deaden language. The point of a regulation or a letter from your insurance company is not to enliven anything, but to state or as impersonally as possible something the reader may take very personally. Propaganda routinely uses language to obscure rather than clarify motives while misrepresenting events or actions. This quandary, how do we use something so devalued as language as the medium for art, is nothing new. The French symbolist poets, Paul Verlaine, Stephanie Mallarmé, Arthur Rimbaud, and co., decreed this dilemma in the late 19th century. Geoffrey Hill, 1932 to 2016, in an essay whose title I have stolen for a chapter in the book, Redeeming the Time, says that poetry inevitably struggles against the inertial drag of speech. Language gravitates and exerts a gravitational pull. This particular statement is made in the context of rhythm, but he amends it to include words themselves in another essay whose title is also the title of this chapter, ominously including the word bond, suggesting both allegiance or trust, to swear a bond, to be bonded, and captivity, to be held in bondage. In each case, he argues that language provides resistance against the work of the poet, and that in struggling to overcome the resistance, poets achieve their art. This linguistic resistance is likely the source of the impulse in poetry for at least the last century to make it new, in Pound's phrase, to make it fresh, different, or sometimes merely strange. From Williams' The Red Wheelbarrow and T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land to Sylvia Plath's Daddy and Greg Rains' A Martian Sends a Postcard Home, modernist and postmodernist poetry have tried to make us see with new eyes, and, more importantly, hear with new ears. One element of the poetic obsession with words is what we term diction, by which we mean the words alone and in combination, the modes of phrasing, and the uses of metaphor and simile that a poet settles upon. For example, at the end of the previous sentence, I used settles upon rather than some other words meaning the same thing. It has the advantage of being grammatically preferred, historically speaking, to settles on, which may sound more modern to some ears. My version may sound perfect to you, or it may seem just a little stiff. Your response will reveal something about your own reading and linguistic experience, as well as my choices. Words have numerous components that attract our attention. We tend to think in terms of meaning, or what we speak of as their semantic level. There is also the syntactic level, which is to say, how the words nestle in among their neighbors. A third level is the aesthetic, which can take a couple of forms. Written language can involve us in visual aesthetics. How does a word look on the page? Is it tall on the ends and short in the middle, or the reverse, or more random in appearance? Is there a clot of consonants in it somewhere, and where? What concerns us more frequently is language in the oral realm. How do the words sound? Light and airy, sturdy and heavy? This aspect of diction, namely how they look and sound, is important. Writers in every language have a number of choices for words in any particular place in a statement. The English, a Germanic language, imports words from French, Latin, Greek, Hindi, Arabic, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, Dano-Norwegian, Inuit, Algonquian, and just about any other language with which it comes in contact. It also has an annoying, or delightful, depending on your viewpoint, habit of simply making words up when the occasion arises, using those other languages, slang, technospeak, and even acronyms as the basis for new words. As a result, the writer in English has a dizzying array of choices for most content words. Those not the, an, a, or various conjunctions and prepositions like and or, and under, and on. And those choices will always convey a story. Is the word long or short? A traditional word dating back to Old English or a newer import? How new? Which language? Greek and geek aren't the same, you know. You don't have to be interested in poetry to see history at work in language. If you ever deal with a will, and it is rare a person who doesn't at some point, you will see the phrase, give, bequeath, and devise. Why? Blame William the Conqueror. In 1066, William, Duke of Normandy, came across the English Channel and defeated English King Harold at the Battle of Hastings, thereby changing the world. If you never learn anything else about the history of the English language, know the date. It marks the beginning of the process of changing our language from something you can neither read nor understand, the purely Germanic language of Old English, to a Germanic language with a heavy overlay of French vocabulary. In practice, Germanic words are generally shorter, harsher, and regarded as cruder. French origin words tend to be longer, softer, and more socially acceptable. Words from Latin are the long, legalistic-sounding ones, but that's another story. After the Norman conquest, lingual documents needed to be clear for both the native, earlier conquerors, Anglo-Saxons, and the newly installed Norman French speakers. Give and bequeath from Old English worked for the first group, devise from Old French for the second. These pairings remained long after the linguistic divide had vanished. How does that work? In the realm of bodily functions, the euphemisms or formal terms are virtually always from Latin. Think fornication, defecation, urination. While the rude terms are from either Old English, the first two, or Old French by way of Middle English, third one. Don't pretend you don't know them. Oh, and 4 letters long. And you thought this stuff would be dull. Want a reason to pay attention to word choice? In the midst of a typically plain-spoken poem, Philip Larkin's Church-Going, 1955, the speaker refers to church in question as an accoutred frosty barn. For someone whose native style is as unflashy as his, this is a spectacular mashup. Accoutred is from French, meaning something like all decked out. Frosty, a word I have never seen from an American writer, is a 19th century corruption of frowsy, which in turn is a 17th century British slang word of unknown origin, meaning musty or stale smelling. And barn is good. Plain English going back to good, plain old English, when it meant the house that stored the barley. It is not inevitably a word we associate with churches, nor are the others, come to think of it. Poetic diction is a really big deal. In fact, the great critic Owen Garfield published an entire book on the subject called, shockingly, Poetic Diction, 1928. His subtle is a study in meaning, and his immediate goal is to examine how the poetic imagination deploys words and metaphor to create meaning. Barfield was part of the Inklings group that included C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, so of course there is more going on than mere literary criticism. In this case, he studies the history of diction and poetry for evidence of a sort of evolution of consciousness. We will limit ourselves here to the more obvious questions of how word choice and placements affects poems. Wait a minute. You mean we're going to go crazy over a bunch of frills and ribbons? Not at all. Diction ain't frilly, Buster. See what I did there? Non-standard ain'ts, colloquial mode of address with Buster. That's diction, and not the version I've mostly been using here. So, what is it exactly? Think of diction as 4 of the 5 W's of journalism. Who, what, when, where, and how. All of which leads to why, naturally enough. What words does the writer use? When and where does he drop them into sentences or fragments? And how do those choices affect what we hear going on as we read? Ultimately, we want to figure out, as best we can, why the writer has made these choices. But that can only be achieved by a sort of literary reverse engineering. Wordsworth said that we murder to dissect, but the reality is we dissect to understand. By the way, the patient usually survives. We can read poetry and other documents, or think we can, because words have more or less stable rules. Adjective may come before or after, but it is always going to be near neighbors with a thing, a noun or pronoun, and its function will likely be descriptive. We have no trouble understanding that a movie title like Ordinary People or Despicable Me because we have seen and heard adjectives used this way all our lives. No need to know the word adjective. The function is clear long before any understanding of the parts of speech. Same thing with nouns and verbs, adverbs and conjunctions. They are mostly stable forms. Occasionally, the culture picks up a noun and turns it into a verb, often to great consternation, as with impact in our own era or share in the 16th century, so long ago that we believe it has always been a verb as well as a noun. This sort of seismic activity in language goes on in all ages, but rarely results in damage to buildings or livestock. Mostly, we live in the assurance that our language is built upon the rock. What parts of speech? But what happens when someone blows those certainties apart? Anyone lived in a pretty how town, with up so floating many bells down, spring, summer, autumn, winter. He sang, his didn't, he danced, his did. Even if you had never seen the poem, if you know anything about E.E. Cummings, you are pretty sure as to the culprit. He has a well-earned reputation for verbing nouns and nouning verbs, but in this poem, those are the least of his crimes. We'll talk about the whole poem in detail later, but for now, let's examine those first 4 lines, wherein he gives us most of the devices he will use in the poem to shake the foundations. The first line is comprehensible in word order, if not meaning. If we substitute more or less any personal pronoun or proper noun, he, they, Sam, she, the subject and verb work together just fine. So too with the problematic how. That position before town needs an adjective rather than an adverb. A pretty farm town, a pretty suburban town. You get the idea. How? Not so much. Like anyone at the beginning, it more or less invites us to substitute any other possibilities precisely because it is so generic. Anyone usually calls for a could or a might. Anyone could be forgiven. Anyone might think. Anyone might concur that anyone does not play well with verbs in the simple past like lived. The second line throws word order out the window. With up so floating many bells down. It may or may not mean something like with so many bells floating up and then down. But as Clinthbrook pointed out decades ago, there is heresy in paraphrasing poetry. In any case, what matters is that the line itself says, is what the line itself says, and of course, how it says it. Because it really matters that so comes, however improbably, between up and floating. If it fell later, say, floating many so bells down, It would not be the same at all. Can I say what the difference would be? Don't be silly. No one could. Because as written, it says what it says, and is what we have. The third line seems straightforward enough. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, just like that. A little surprising, maybe, to have anything appear in correct, natural order in this poem, but it does. It recurs throughout the poem with different seasons and the initial spot, from spring to autumn and finally summer batting lead off. But it maintains the order, suggesting the passage of time. But then order vanishes in a masterful instance of nouning verbs. He sang his didn't, he danced his did. Semantically, the line appears meaningless. Our ears tell us we need nouns for didn't, did, sorrow, joy would work, or even ego, id, I'd. This reminds us, of course, that the clause is structurally perfect, only apparently nonsensical. If we take a little time to reflect, though, we may find some meaning after all. Didn't and did can suggest negation and affirming, or inaction and action, or even non-being and being. If we listen for the sense imparted by the words rather than insisting on a traditional model, we see a host of possibilities for the line's meaning. In rejecting the world's function in favor of their potential implications, Cummings shifts the linguistic paradigms. That's good, because he will pursue that shift through the remainder of the poem, as we shall see later. Before we leave this passage, it would be unfair not to admit that it is a whole lot of fun to say, even if you stumble. Maybe because you stumble. Stumbling is half the fun. Therein lies the secret to Cummings' charm. He leaves you baffled, but smiling. Speaking like your peeps. The social compact can also be battered by the use of dialect. We know the expected words, the usual suspects. What we may not know are the words from another linguistic tradition, be it ethnic, regional, or national, even though it's all ostensibly English. Such usage may seem designed to limit a poem's availability to most readers, and it can have that effect. We have to explain, then, how Robert Burns remains one of the most popular poets in the English language. Do you know of any other poet whose birthday is an occasion for international celebration, other than possibly Shakespeare, or even whose birthday is known by the general public? January 25th, in case you're not Scottish or Canadian. Whose best-known poem is mangled by drunks each New Year's Eve? Try that with proofread. A Burns poem in dialect will often feature many sections where we can almost find our way interspersed with moments of incomprehension, as in these two critical stanzas of To a Mouse. Thy wee bit heap o' leaves and stibble has cost thee money a weary nibble. Now thou's turned out for a fie trouble, but house or hold, to dull the winter's sleety dribble, and cranrouge cowled. But mousie, thou art no fie lame, improving foresight may be vain. The best laid schemes o' mice and men gang aft agly, and lee us naught but grief and pain, for promised joy. The speaker has turned up a mouse's nest with his plow, resulting in an all-around calamity. The mouse needs the nest to survive the winter, while the humans gain nothing by the destruction except a sense of guilt. The two stanzas focus on the salient point of desolation despite careful planning and economy. The little heap of materials and supplies, the speaker says, cost you plenty, but now you're turned out of your house even with all your effort, and winter sleet and crushing cold will beset you. Most of that first stanza is manageable. We can more or less figure out stibble and house or hold, and if we can't manage to vol on its own, we can figure out from winter's sleety dribble that it means that it's going to mean something like endure, which it does. But then what in the world are we going to make out of cranrouge called? If we've read a bit of Burns before, we may get that called is a phonetic rendering of our very own cold. Cranrouge, on the other hand, is beyond our ken. In fact, it is a Scots word for hoarfrost, the frozen form of dew. You can never get there on your own, but coupled with the context, you know it is something soul-crushing and possibly bone-crunching for the mouse. The second stanza is fairly straightforward, excepting lane for alone or on your own and gang aft agly for conventional Englishes oft times go awry, which is how it came down to me. Indeed, that may be the most comprehensible alien line in literature, because the culture has taught us what follows. The best laid schemes, O mice and men. If there were any doubts, the last two lines completes the thought, and leave us naught but grief and pain, for promised joy. We may not glean every morsel from the lines, but we can certainly follow the gist. We find ourselves rewarded with the many wry comments, not least of them his addressing of his victims as mousy, which invokes a curious sort of kinship between these two unequal strivers. Part of the joy of a Burns poem, for some readers, is precisely the alien element that dialect brings to the commonplace. Anyone who has turned over soil will have had the experience of uprooting some other creatures who have done us no harm, but we won't have produced our thoughts in such unearthly language. Dialect poetry is always a vexed subject. How much is too much? Is it accurate depiction or caricature? Does it exclude outsiders unfamiliar with the dialect? What does it mean to move back and forth between dialect and standard English? Paul Laurence Dunbar, who often used African American dialect in his poems, here chooses to write in mainstream English. Compensation. Because I had loved so deeply, because I had loved so long, God in his great compassion gave me the gift of song. Because I have loved so vainly, and sung with such faltering breath, the Master in infinite mercy offers the boon of death. His dialect poems raised objections for possibly bringing the race into disrepute or reducing them to caricatures. But he wanted to reach multiple audiences, and when he wished to reach white readers, he knew how to produce standard English. The first stanza of the poem sits as sort of an architectural epigraph on the facade of the Dayton, Ohio, Metro Library's main branch in Dunbar's hometown. I read it many times in my youth, inspired to know that a famous poet had come from my blue-collar community. The library wisely omits the second, rather less inspiring stanza. I include it here not as a source of study, but as evidence, if such were needed, that Dunbar was fully capable of writing in standard English. He may be better known for his dialect poems, which he calls minors, in contrast to the standard English majors, but those poems were controversial when he first published them, and have never stopped being so.
So then, words. Can't live with them, can't live without them. Wallace Stevens has a poem called Men Made Out of Words, which could be the anthem, adjusted for gender, for poets everywhere. Stuck with the same lousy, degraded building blocks as lawyers and propagandists and writers of college regs and hashtaggers, they strive to make something new.